Okay, so nice to see you all. Erev Tov, Masa al-Khair, good evening, and also Boker Tov, Sabah al-Khair, and good morning to Dr. Hilary Falb Kalisman. That's further away in Boulder, snowy, 9 inches of snow. I'm excited because this evening for me, it's a real celebration. First of all, for a dear friend and colleague, finishing a much anticipated project, which is this book that we're going to hear about. But it's a celebration not only for her, I think it's a celebration for the entire field of history of education in the modern Middle East, and also in general, more broadly, for the history of colonial education and the links between colonialism and nationalism and liberation. I don't want to take much of her time. Hilary is going to talk about the book for like 30, 35 minutes. And then we're going to open the floor for questions. So please do wait patiently. You can write it in the comment section or ask it verbally, whatever you want. And I just want to mention, I do recommend reading this book and buying it through Amazon or the different other channels that you can buy it. Why? So you're going to hear a lot about the book soon, but I just want to say that this is like a very thorough work of an historian. Hilary writes about these people who travel around the borders of the Middle East, right? All these teachers that move around. The book is about teachers, but she also did this traveling to do the research. And this is very strong, very apparent in the book, that she visited archives in Lebanon and in Jordan and in Palestine and in Israel. And she talked to people in all of those places and in Europe and the United States, and anything she could lay her hand on to make a good argument about who were these people and what was their influence during this period and also afterwards is very, it's felt very strongly in this project. So I do recommend buying it and reading it and then talking about it and writing a good review about it. So just two more words before she starts talking about the project. So Hilary Falb Kalisman, Dr. Hilary Falb Kalisman is an assistant professor of history and endowed professor of Israel-Palestine studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Her research focuses on history of education, colonialism, state, and nation building. So we're going to talk about this book published in Princeton University Press in September 2022. So this is fairly early to talk about this book. This is the first book talk that she's giving. So let's be nice and let's receive her with niceness and warmth. Hilary, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Shukran, toda rabba. I wanted to thank Yoni for organizing, also to Mizrach Tichon Haifa. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this book, actually somewhere where I, sort of virtually somewhere where I wrote so much of it. I lived for 3 years in Haifa while finishing up my dissertation. So the book is really about a few things. So first, it's about Britain's Middle Eastern mandates, Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, as well as their successor states. So in this book, I do not focus on the Yishuv in Palestine because it wasn't really part of the systems I'm describing, and I'm happy to discuss why it wasn't more in the Q&A. So my book is about how teachers used to be an elite and well-traveled group. It's also about a particular moment in the history of interwar politics. It's about how we can understand public education as both part of growing national bureaucracies and as something which cross national borders. And finally, it's about stories of the educators who shaped the modern Middle East. So today I'm going to use rather a famous story to talk about the main themes of this book, the story of Akram Zuwaiter. So on the left in this image, you can see Akram Zuwaiter. He's the seated one with a mustache. So he's one of the most famous Palestinian nationalists who also worked as a teacher in both Palestine and in Iraq. He then ended up as a repeat ambassador, minister, and senator in Jordan. I opened the book with 1933 letters between Zuwaiter and his Palestinian colleague Darwish al-Mikdadi, who were both teaching in Iraq. They wrote to one another about the need to bring in more young Arab men and believers in the Arab cause to Iraq. At that time, Iraq was a leader, both in importing educators from throughout the Arab world and also in interwar pan-Arabism. So Zuwaiter was a Palestinian pan-Arab and anti-imperial nationalist who liked to alternate teaching with journalism, political activism, writing textbooks and histories. You can see the textbook he authored with Darwish al-Mikdadi, Our History and Stories, on the right. So why were these men teaching in Iraq during the 1930s? Who and what brought them and why? So we can see the answers to these questions actually in the photograph in the middle. And so this depicts the editorial committee of Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, The Strongest Bond, which was a pan-Arab club at the American University of Beirut. This club was founded in 1918, and its goal was to improve students' writing and public speaking in Arabic and to teach them about parliamentary laws. It sponsored Arabic speaking contests and plays, and by 1921, an illustrated journal. Its members came from throughout the Arabic speaking world. So although the people in the photograph do not include Darwish al-Mikdadi or Akram Zuwaiter, both of these men attended the American University of Beirut. The photograph does include on the bottom left another mustachioed fellow, Fadel al-Jamali, an Iraqi who, after working as a teacher, rose through the ranks of Iraq's educational system, and he's actually the person who hired Zuwaiter and al-Mikdadi. He hired them because they were fellow AUB graduates, or alums in Zuwaiter's case, fellow believers in a pan-Arab nationalism, and because the Iraqi government wanted to expand education and didn't have enough people in the country with post-secondary degrees. So Jamali himself would end up briefly a prime minister before being first sentenced to death, then exiled after Iraq's revolution that took place in 1958. So there are some other names that appear in this photograph that we will talk about later. There is Yusuf Zainal, who was an Iraqi on the top right, who would actually get in trouble for leading demonstrations in Iraq in the 1920s. And then you also have Wasfi Anabtawi, a textbook author whose books were used in Palestine, Transjordan, and into Jordan. So the story of these men and Akram Zuwaiter show three important aspects of what education was like during the interwar era. So teachers were in demand across the region. Being a teacher connected one with high-ranking officials, and teachers engaged in a political ideology of Arab unity, among other ideologies. My book discusses roughly two generations of educators, the last of the Ottomans and the first of the Mandates. So during this era, when you became a teacher in a government school, you joined the region's largest and lowest ranking group of civil servants, taking what could often be the first step in a government career. These careers assumed a certain amount of movement in and out of various types of government work for various governments, but more concretely, travel. After World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations granted the British and the French authority over this part of the Middle East, dividing it into Class A mandates, which were allegedly to allow Britain and France to ease the mandate inhabitants' transition from Ottoman subjects to citizens of modern nation states, in Palestine supporting a Jewish national home. The mandates themselves were also a form of European colonialism. By 1932, Iraq had, on paper, a semi-independent status with a monarchy, while Transjordan also had a monarchy, and Palestine, but both were still under British mandatory regimes, Lebanon and Syria under French ones. This lasted through 1946 for Transjordan, 1948 for Palestine, and to very different degrees to 1958 for Iraq. There were not very many government schools in the mandates. What this meant is if you wanted to attend a high school, a secondary school, you would need to already live in or travel to an urban area. If you wanted to teach in a secondary school, you would have had to go to a post-secondary institution. Accepting Hebrew University and the Technion in the Mandate for Palestine, which were not very accessible to Arabs, there was little post-secondary education in the mandates. In the Ottoman era, students might travel to Istanbul for higher education and then to other Ottoman provincial cities for work. When you get the mandates, suddenly Istanbul is in another country. And for those living in Britain's mandates, French or Ottoman Turkish weren't as important languages as English. This meant the American University of Beirut in particular became more appealing as it taught in English, and it was also way cheaper to go there than going to the United Kingdom or the United States. As educators traveled to get higher education, to teach, to work for governments, they also learned and taught both regional and national affiliations. Zuwaiter, as well as Jamali, who are pretty unique in the amount of information they leave behind and how famous they were not so atypical in their mobility and their rise to power. Altogether, about a third of the prime ministers who served in Iraq from the 1950s through the 1960s, and in Jordan from the end of the mandate through the early 1970s, were former teachers. Essentially, all of them had studied or had worked abroad. So my book follows the rise and fall of this kind of elite period in the lives of educators from the final years of the Ottoman Empire through the 1960s, which is when mass education kind of ends this place that educators had in governance and society. I argue that during the interwar era, limited public education combined with a demand for schooling meant teachers enjoyed a relatively privileged status. Government education generally meant a government job. For teachers, this meant they could lobby with their governments for their own benefits, including increased salaries. They could promote various ideologies in the classroom. They could take on second jobs and even protest their governments, all while still working for them. This status ended with a combination of mass education and nation states, which happened when Britain left. So chapter 1 of the book looks at the Ottoman Empire, showing how links between government schooling and government service and the need to travel for both incorporated educators into the Ottoman state through networks that persisted, if often in changed forms, into the Mandate era. The middle part of the book shows how British policies exacerbated a lack of educational institutions and educators across the region. People in this region really wanted more education. Educators could then capitalize on their scarcity to push the limits of what it meant to be a teacher while still being employed. Educators themselves also moved across mandate borders. Governments had little choice but to accept and support this travel, even though as educators, their ideas, their articles, and even the textbooks they wrote didn't fit mandate boundaries. Educators also participated in rebellions during the 1930s. However, they joined from within rather than outside of government service, meaning they tended to be less engaged in physically rebelling than other parts of the mandate populations. Their beliefs included anti-imperial ideologies, such as territorial nationalisms, pan-Arabism, fascism, and communism. As governments gained independence in the 1940s and 1950s, and Palestinians faced diaspora and occupation, state ideologies, including Zionism, became more rigid, and new political actors eclipsed the teachers, politicians, and the beliefs of the interwar era. As Pan-Arabism itself changed from an anti-imperial revolutionary movement to a state ideology, it became more inflexible, excluding many of its former supporters, particularly in Iraq, such as the educators and politicians who had risen to power during the mandates. Mass education itself became a crucial part of nation states, but it ended the automatic links between government education and government employment that had previously benefited teachers. Educators' qualifications improved, but they lost their role as elites. Instead, they joined unions to try to use collective bargaining to get benefits, but these unions were generally repressed by Iraq, Jordan, and even Israel's governments. Today, teachers' unions still call for strikes across the region. The loss of educators' individual power and status that came with mass education continues today. Okay, so what are some of the contributions I'm trying to make in this book? So one of them is about understanding how states work. Oh, Who are we? There we go. All right. So government education is an institution that is meant to help consolidate state infrastructures and bureaucracies. The teachers I study in this book were civil servants, so technically they represented the mandate governments. However, the fact that they moved between territories, worked for multiple governments, and also were often in and out of the civil service shows how hard it is to find exactly when states end and societies begin. The other thing my research brought to light is this relative freedom that teachers enjoyed. And this was in part because no one really wanted the very few literate individuals in the region to be forbidden from teaching, even though teachers were essentially all anti-imperial. This meant educators both helped form states because they worked for them and disrupted them in that they moved in and out of states' jurisdiction and government service and protested those states and their policies. So the other big contribution my book is trying to make has to do with education and nationalisms. So when you read scholarship on education, especially in the Middle East, it really focuses on nationalism. Scholars tend to argue that state school systems are how people in countries in general learn about nationalism. In this book, as you can see by the stories of the teachers I've talked about, I really needed to look at public education not nationally, but across national borders. In the interwar period, the new borders of the mandates, colonial jurisdictions as well, meant that national, regional, and international ideologies, from Palestinian, Iraqi, and Transjordanian nationalism to Pan-Arabism to communism and fascism, existed at the same time and were taught in the mandate schools. Educators engaged in politics in a lot of ways. Conversations within and outside the classroom, journal articles, secret or semi-secret societies, and negotiations with governments. Educators could write and even lead protests against their governments while remaining in the civil service. They could become high-ranking officials and ministers, but their ability to make big political changes was limited by the mandate's colonial structure. When the mandates ended, education expanded like crazy. This meant educators became more common, but it meant they weren't elites anymore. And they also had to deal with much more powerful states that cared way more about what exactly educators were teaching. Okay, so how did I write this book? So in order to trace trends in schooling across the region, I wrote a collective biography. So what this means is I kind of combined individual stories of teachers where I had more information with analyses of trends for educators in the mandates altogether. So nearly all of the teachers I analyzed weren't as famous or extraordinary as Akram Zuwaiter. They did not leave behind diaries or a trail of official complaints in their wake. They appear as a few details in a British colonial office file, a name in a Baghdad Jewish school register in the Babylonian Jewry Center in Or Yehuda, in a photograph in the archives at the American University of Beirut. I'm really happy to talk about Olga Wahbe, the woman in the middle of the photograph during the Q&A, or as a statistic in documents from the Ministry of Education in Jordan. Examining teachers as a collective allowed me to make a broad analysis of patterns in educational systems, while also tracing individuals as they skipped from one government to another. It did mean I ended up using about 12 archives. The state of some of the archives I went to was not great, as you can see in this clip from the video of the Ministry of Education warehouse, although other scholars, particularly Mesna Cato, have used these files as well. I also had to be creative in order to balance differences in the amount of material available in the three countries. So I would use not only official documents and newspapers, but also fictional works and some oral histories. Okay, so when I'm making this argument that teachers were scarce during the interwar period, what does that look like? So this slide shows the number of government school teachers during the first decade of the mandate years. Okay, so one of the things you will notice right off the bat is there really aren't that many public school teachers at all. Secondly, that you will see in Iraq, particularly starting in the 1930s, was increasing its number of teachers. So, you know, in certain ways, this is a bit of an unfair comparison. Iraq is much bigger than the other countries, but it also points to the fact that as British control over education lessens, the number of people educating and being educated increases. So let's see how this works into the 1950s. So here you can see after British control ends in Jordan in 1946, and as it lessens and then ends in Iraq by 1958, the number of educators skyrockets. While in Palestine, it's a much less drastic increase. So again, one thing to keep in mind, right, is that Jordan's population almost doubles with its annexation of the West Bank after 1948. But if we look at the next slide, this shows the percentage of total budget devoted to education. So what you can see is that when Britain has less control, the budget for education drastically increases. And I'm happy to talk about why there's that dip in the situation of Iraq, which is actually directly correlated to more British control. Okay, so we can see that one of the factors why there weren't that many teachers during the interwar period is clearly a lack of funding. So why is there a lack of funding? The British officials involved in education and their mandates are really afraid of over-educating the populations under their control, and that it will lead to a rebellious nationalist unemployed group. Adapting policies from other colonial territories, particularly Egypt, the British hoped to use education to separate out an English-speaking government-employed elite from a peaceful class of economically productive farmers and mothers. But it costs less to hire local people. So one of the reasons why Iraq was importing teachers was because British officials had technically given up control over Iraqi education in 1923, after Iraq's rebellion in 1920. So you can see kind of like Iraq's capacity to open schools and to train and import educators increased whenever British influence faded. Okay, so as we've seen, one of the key places where educators get their education and also network with one another is the American University of Beirut. So as you can see from this picture, right, Beirut is a lovely seaside city. There, people from throughout the region and even the world would meet at the American University. They would be in the same classrooms, they would share experiences, and also they would gain access to a regional network of contacts. So often once one AUB alum was in place, they would hire fellow alumni. Graduates had bachelor's degrees and English skills, and this meant they were really overrepresented as educators and civil servants in the bureaucracies of the mandates. So on the right, you can see one of the descriptions of an alumni branch. So by the 1930s, there were branches all over, from Baghdad to Khartoum, New York to Damascus, and many others. At alumni events, you would have not only alumni, but also foreign dignitaries, local politicians, which would solidify connections between AUB graduates and politics. So for example, in 1930, the Baghdad branch of the Alumni Association brought together male and female graduates from Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon, alongside officials, teachers, and dignitaries. So not having a lot of teachers or schools and not wanting to spend a lot of money on education also meant that textbooks, as well as their authors, were international. So this is actually especially true for books on Arabic literature, grammar, and history, but also books on civics, math, sciences, and object lessons. During the interwar period, books tended to travel from Egypt, Palestine, and Syria to Iraq and Transjordan. So the Iraqi government actually published Darwish al-Mikdadi and Akram Zuwaiter's works. So Transjordan also used geography and history books written explicitly for the schools of Palestine, such as those of AUB graduate Wasfiya Nabtawi, who wrote the book on the right, which is actually explicitly says it's used in the schools of Transjordan, and it's written with somebody named Hosni Faris, who is Transjordanian, but also went to AUB, worked as a teacher, and is a very famous poet. So over time, the mandates tended to produce more of their own textbooks. But the thing is that the majority of the authors of these textbooks had actually all studied at the American University of Beirut as well. So what did these textbooks say? So they're usually anti-imperial, but they're also a bit politically vague. They tend to put forward a broad idea of pan-Arabism, which definitely includes Palestine, but because of the sort of colonial political situation, they don't offer a very concrete political program. So in terms of politics, teachers put their politics into practice in the classroom. Memoirs of people who were students in the mandates often talk about how they would learn from pan-Arab nationalist or communist teachers and then participate in demonstrations. Many of these were against British imperialism and Zionism particularly in Palestine. Several of these protests are really well studied, but they tend to be really well studied just within the context of each mandate. The following two incidents show international connections between protests and also how teachers could engage in these protests without permanent consequences. The regionalism of these protests is pretty stark, as some of the same teachers actually participate in both. So in 1925, the Arab College of Jerusalem, which was an elite teacher training institution and high school in the Mandate for Palestine, went on strike, led by teachers as well as students against the visit of Lord Balfour to Palestine on the occasion of the founding of Hebrew University and the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. This declaration, which proclaimed Britain's support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, was included in the Charter of the Mandate for Palestine. So protesting it was technically protesting the mandate itself. Teachers included AUB graduates and former members of Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa. So first, the teachers involved weren't permanently punished. They don't actually get fired. Several of them quit though. Protests against the Balfour Declaration became a yearly occurrence. Moreover, two of those participating are actually involved in a similar incident 2 years later in Iraq. So skipping ahead to Iraq, an AUB graduate, Anis Nusuli, who was also a former editor of the Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa journal, published a textbook which was offensive to some Shia. He was teaching in the government secondary school of Baghdad, which you can see on the right. So he was initially dismissed after Shia parents complained, but then other teachers, including Yusuf Zainal, who we saw on that first slide in Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa again, staged a protest. They had students in the secondary school and at the teachers' college out in force protesting Nusuli's dismissal and actually demanding freedom of speech. The teachers were initially dismissed, but then shortly reinstated. So these incidents clearly show the importance of AUB and its educators, the fact that the educational system was a site of protest, and also that teachers had a bit of leeway with which to protest. The protests are talked about quite a lot by historians, but they're generally framed as nationalist, Palestinian and Iraqi. So with Palestine, it's about the growth of Palestinian nationalism against Zionism. In Iraq, it's about Iraqi nationalism rather than sectarian divides. These things are true. These are incredibly important parts of these protests. But the fact that two of the same people are participating in both of them means we need to rethink how education and protest works in a regional context. So for Hisham Sharabi, an AUB graduate and later one of the most prominent Arab intellectuals of the 20th century, the American University of Beirut during the interwar period was a place full of enthusiasm and patriotism. So in this quote, Sharabi voices an almost painful nostalgia for the interwar era, despite British and French colonial control of the region. As he remembers it, he, and we can also extrapolate this to the pan-Arab teachers of the mandates, was fighting against imperialism. The Arabs he talks about were fighting against Britain and France rather than against one another. That is, until nation states come crashing down in the 1940s and 1950s. As British control receded, things drastically changed for educators and former educators. Former educators like Jamali reached the highest levels of governance. Even the Palestinian Akram Zuwaiter, who during the course of his life was arrested several times for his nationalist rabble-rousing, despite this, he was incorporated into the Jordanian government by the 1960s as an ambassador, minister, and a member of Senate in the early 1980s. So these teacher politicians actually fall generally into two categories. They're part of kind of an old guard of elites or a very limited wave of technocrats. So most teacher politicians are from elite families who spent a few years teaching in the best schools of their country, either before entering official politics or when they were on the outs with whichever government was in power. A few people entered politics after a career in education. So Zuwaiter, by the time he's incorporated into official Jordanian politics, is more of a figurehead. He's a symbol of Pan-Arabism, of the inclusion of Palestinians, but he's old, and he's sort of seen as less likely to disrupt Jordan's government. Geopolitically, during this period, things are really different. Pan-Arabism stopped being a revolutionary anti-imperial movement and became a state ideology among states which had competing interests. So Gamal Abdel Nasser's ideas of Pan-Arabism in Egypt didn't mesh well with those of Fatal al-Jamali for various reasons, which he actually talks about in this Middle East Forum article, which is published shortly before he would be sentenced to death after the 1958 revolution in Iraq, which ended British influence there and Iraq's monarchy. Also, as I'm sure we can all understand, Israeli Zionism and Palestinian nationalism and/or Pan-Arabism did not mix well in the new state of Israel. So what happened to more rank and file teachers with the end of the mandates? With nation states comes standardization and, as we've seen, increased funding for education. Teaching becomes a more regular and better qualified profession. These trends also contributed to a decline in teachers' social and economic status. Teachers lost their roles as elites in this situation without the profession becoming feminized, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. So in Iraq, mass education coincided with mass protests and teachers' unionization. As their numbers increased, teachers' salaries in Iraq radically decreased in real value. This decrease had political as well as economic ramifications. Teachers and other civil servants began to participate more and more in mass protests, particularly as part of the Iraqi Communist Party. Their turns to collective protests failed in the face of increased scrutiny and, by the Ba'ath period, repression. So at this point, they went from being kind of future politicians, part of state authority, to fighting that authority head on until they're not allowed to anymore. In Jordan, as educated individuals became more plentiful, teaching became a profession. During the mandate period, education had been more of kind of a temporary thing people would do in between getting more education or getting a better government job. By the 1950s, teachers tended to remain teachers rather than moving on to other government offices. They also tended to complain much more about their pay. When they tried to unionize in 1956, their union was shut down within a year and wasn't allowed to reopen until 2012. For Palestinians, the broad decline in teacher status is similar, especially if they actually were in Iraq or Jordan, but often more extreme. Palestinian teachers in refugee camps either worked as volunteers or were paid less than cleaners were right after 1948. The most they were paid in the 1950s was less than teachers received during the mandate period. Palestinian teachers in Israel were paid half the amount of their Jewish counterparts until 1952. When teachers' protests led to raises in their salary, making them equivalent to those of Jewish teachers. Palestinian teachers could join Israel's teachers' unions, and they had their own division, but they weren't allowed to elect the head of their division, who had to be Jewish. So these unions for Palestinians could be a place to lobby for better working conditions, but not as a political platform. Across the board, secondary education became more widely available. So this improved teachers' credentials relative to previous decades. More of them had high school degrees. But it also meant that having a high school degree didn't guarantee you a government job anymore, and it certainly didn't give you a lot of prestige. Instead, teachers became more of what we think of today: overworked, underpaid, not future members of parliament. So what I hope you've seen from my talk is that during the interwar era, a lack of schools and teachers, as well as a regional demand for them, led teachers to travel, to be part of a more elite group, to climb the ranks of government service, and to engage in a range of political ideologies, particularly Pan-Arabism, but also Palestinian, Iraqi, and Jordanian nationalisms and communism. This situation, as we have seen, ended with the end of the mandates. As schooling in nation states expanded their reach, educators lost their elite status and individual bargaining power, turning to collective rebellions. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. And there's a discount code.
Thank you, Hilary. It was fascinating. So I can see that we already have one question from Alyssa, so go ahead.
So that was actually clapping, but I do have a couple of questions.
Oh, you were clapping. But you do have.
I do have questions. Don't worry. And Hilary, I read the book right when it came out. I had it on. I kept checking to see when it was released. So, one of the questions I had was about sort of the numbers slide and the increase in teachers. One of the things that I've been sort of grappling with in my own research, and that maybe just a couple more seconds on the slide would help, is trying to compare. So an increase, for example, in teachers, but you also are seeing an increase in population size potentially at this time. So if we're talking about, a growing number of teachers, but it's growing so slowly, are we actually seeing potentially increased scarcity in terms of like needing more classrooms, needing more teachers and that kind of thing? And how did that sort of actually parse out in your research? And also it was, clapping.
No, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say like, during the interwar period, it's something where like I wanted to have a record of like just like the absolute numbers of teachers, in part because it's like in Jordan, okay, if there are 144 teachers, we can know exactly who all of them are, right? But I think one of the like, sort of, it's something though where in all of these countries, there's a very clear demand for education. Like in all of them this whole time, you have more people trying to go to school than can. And this is really the case across the board. So I do think it would be really interesting to go back and sort of try to correlate with shifting populations, especially like considering which population is actually going to these schools. And one of the things you don't see in this slide is, sort of one of the things like the British tend to do is actually to rely a lot on private schools, missionary schools, to kind of pick up the slack in education as well. Right. So like these are the numbers of public school teachers, but I didn't include the numbers of teachers in private schools, the number of private schools there are, et cetera, because those are also, sort of catering particularly to kind of, sort of like Christian in Iraq, also like Jewish, other kind of like religious ethnic minority populations as well. But I do think it would be interesting to think about like, is this scarcity actually worse than I'm seeing because I didn't correlate it with population increases? So that's a really good question.
Any other questions, crowd? I have a question and then some more questions from the crowd. First, why teachers? Why did you choose teachers? Why is this an interesting profession? And what caught you about these people that was so interesting to dedicate, your work? If we look, I mean, your PhD and then the articles that you wrote, and now this entire book. And second, I think one of the most fascinating things about this book is I think one of the main arguments is this dialectic nature of what happens with education, is that colonial period, interwar period, we have this movement, this flexibility and fluidity of ideas and people and agency of teachers. One of their greatest project is mass education, right? Is literacy for all. And then when literacy is achieved and mass education is achieved and independence is achieved, right? The post-colonial era initiates. The opposite happens with the status of the teacher. So, and I think Hisham Sharabi says that, but I think many of them say that in a way they miss this flexibility and fluidity and agency people had under colonial rule. So could you expand just a bit more about this dialectic? And also, the book, just a little spoiler, the book takes the reader into post-independence, but ends with 2019 and nowadays, and contemporary demonstrations of teachers and the devastating situation in the Arab world. So are we actually talking about mass education, but in a terrible state since independence, like a longue durée, 60, 70 years of mass education, but bad mass education. So first, why teachers? And second, perhaps a few more words about this dialectic nature of the role of teachers from colonial to post-colonial era.
Great. So I think in terms of why teachers, it's something where like I've always been really interested in education. Like I come from a family of educators. I also think education is like a particularly interesting historical location because a lot of times it's where you get, you know, sort of the ideals of a government or a religion or a people that come up against the hard reality of the fact that like, what funding do you get? What exactly are the children doing? Who really wants to send their kids to school? Is there a building? That sort of thing. So I like that kind of, that is a place where people really like state their ideals, you know, and then you deal with sort of like the practices and how it works. In terms of the teachers, it was something where like I actually started by looking specifically at teachers in Palestine. I was looking for documents available on education. And for Palestinian teachers, as you know, right, there are these wonderful teachers' personnel files where you have these very intimate details of teachers, you know, sort of not just their biographical details, but also them writing petitions, letters, villages writing letters to the government. And it was this really sort of interesting place where, you know, you were able to see this kind of different sort of individual agency. And then from there, I was like, wait a minute, all of these people are traveling, right? Like I can't just stop their stories by limiting it to one place. I need to follow them and see how this works in a regional context. And I also think the fact that there were so few literate people at this time relatively made teachers more interesting because they were people who are writing and talking, but they're not, you know, they're not necessarily the same type of elites that we normally see in histories as well. So in terms of this dialectic, one of the things I want to be clear is like, I don't want to argue that it was like better for more people back in the mandate period. Like way less people are going to school, right? Again, like there are very few people who are able to benefit from an education during this era, right? Like this is one of the reasons also why nation states, the second they get sort of control of their budgets, understand that they need to make their populations better educated. But I think one of the things I found there is, okay, right, so when you have a government that sees its population as kind of part of it, it spends way more money on educating that population. On the other hand, it also cares way more about what that population is doing in a kind of very different way than the British colonial regime did. So it actually sort of becomes much more controlling. Education, and particularly in Iraq, becomes a real means of surveillance of what people are saying in the classroom. And again, the consequences for teachers go from, in the mandate period, you would get transferred if you were really pushing the government. After the Ba'ath Party is in power in Iraq, you can be disappeared. Like it's a very different situation. But I would say, I think, for teachers, this kind of individual social status, having teaching actually be more of an elite profession, you know, was something that like they do look back on with nostalgia, and it makes sense, right? Like if you know, back in that last slide, the teacher is talking, you know, with that, the banner in Jordan, like they're talking about how the teacher has lost their dignity. And part of what my book is trying to show is, yes, actually, there was a period where teachers in a certain sense had more dignity. Now, again, it's not, you know, it's not perfect. It is not this way for every teacher, but again, sort of like relatively, this is a situation where, again, like, and Jordan is one of the most kind of extreme examples because Jordan only has one full high school for the entire mandate. So what this means is anybody who went to high school in Jordan who got like a full 4 years of high school went to the same school together. And the teachers in it are also people who then go on to work for the government or, if they're not like doing well with that particular government configuration, they go back and teach for a little bit. So it's something where this school is really like a crazy bottleneck of networking and and a way of sort of like social mobility for a few people as well. So again, I think it's a paradox, but I also think it's important to remember that with mass education, more people get educated, right? And more people are able to kind of enjoy the benefits of education as opposed to this earlier period.
Yes, and I definitely think that, I mean, I know about your next projects, but I think that going into the 70s and the 80s is something that we need to at least discuss, as and what happens in these states post-Ba'athist and into Syria's Ba'ath, Iraq's Ba'ath, and so on and so forth. So we have 3 questions, and what's nice about Zoom is that you have an order, right? So we're fortunate to have Nimrod Ben Zev here with us, and then Adi Livni, and then Ido Shachar. Nimrod, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Yoni. And I'll be doing, thank you so much, Hilary. I'll be doing the terrible thing, like the worst Israeli offense of listening to the Zoom and actually participating in from my car. It's like, which is disgusting, and I apologize. But I was wondering, to the points, to the sort of the topic that you and Hilary, you and Yoni were discussing just now. From your answer, it sounds, it's abundantly clear that we can't separate sort of the trajectory of education systems from the trajectory of the states themselves and the tragedies and the sort of very painful post-independence history of many of these regimes. But you also said earlier, and I also arrived late to add offense to injury, so maybe you addressed this. But you also said earlier that we're approaching this more familiar sort of trope-like status of underpaid and overworked for teachers, right? And I wonder to what extent
we don't, Nimrod, are you with us? You faded away. Nimrod. Okay. Unless he returns in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Adi? And finish the question. Or you want to answer to what he said until now?
Got to know a little bit more. I need like one more sentence.
Okay. So Adi,
yeah,
please.
Okay. Thank you, Hilary. It was fascinating, and I'm sorry I also arrived late. So I hope you didn't I didn't miss a lot of spoilers. I was wondering if you can say a bit more about questions of continuity and rupture, because obviously the situation in Palestine is different than in Iraq and Jordan. And of course, I'm interested mainly in the context of the Arab College. Can you say a bit what happened to some of the teachers and to students after 1948, and where did they find themselves?
No, that's a really good question. And so the thing is, right, I mean, like you're right. So in Iraq and Jordan, like the institutions that these teachers were working at, that they taught at, that they went to, continued to exist. For Palestinians, right, like the Arab College of Jerusalem didn't. It's shut down, like the building is appropriated, like the last principle of it, the one who was most important, the 1948 is kind of too much for him. He has a heart attack. Like it is a really difficult situation. So one of the things, though, is for a lot of the teachers who graduated, who did have these credentials, they would use them, right? So suddenly, like if you had a degree from AUB, this is something portable, right? This is something you can take with you, even if you don't have immovable property anymore. And right, there's been a lot written about sort of the value of education for Palestinians as something that you can take with you. so, right, like Darwish al-Maqdadi ends up heading up education in Kuwait, and he tries to bring in a lot of Palestinian teachers in order to do that. And again, Jordan, right, suddenly they've incorporated like this huge number of Palestinians. And so they, they kind of leave a lot of those institutions that were in the West Bank like in place. And also like a lot of kind of norms from the Mandate for Palestine then get kind of like incorporated into the Jordanian system along with these people, also because a lot of them were kind of there from the Mandate era as well. Jordan used a lot of, sort of materials, rules, et cetera, from the Palestine Mandate. And again, now you have educated Palestinians working in this Jordanian system. But again, it's not all that rosy, right? Like, as I talked about, sort of, if you are a Palestinian teacher in a refugee camp, like initially the conditions are pretty bad. And right, also if you're working, you can't necessarily get like rations in the same way. So people were also deciding, is it better for me to work or is it better for me to receive sort of like benefits from UNRWA. That said, right, like particularly in Jordan, you do see like a lot of continuities with the earlier period, again, like with the sort of books, with personnel, even with politicians being able to kind of stay in power, with some ruptures in the 50s. I would say like in Iraq, you, like, again, even though you would have kind of more continuities because this stuff is still there, the Ba'ath period is really in many ways, it is a really big rupture, particularly for educators. And again, sort of in terms of what politics are you allowed to engage in? Also sort of in that in-between period, you have like the teachers' union elections actually being like a stand-in for official politics. And so it's something where like the people you vote for in the teachers' union is kind of a way of signaling how you would vote if you could vote freely in elections. And again, sort of with the Ba'ath period and fits and starts, this really ends. But again, there's also like a huge explosion of mass education. So there's a lot of continuities and ruptures. But again, I would again sort of generally say though, across the board for teachers, the situation generally tends to get worse with the like particular dynamics for Palestinians, depending on where they find themselves after 1948.
Ido.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, this always happens. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I haven't read your book yet, but I will surely do so. I wanted to ask about, sorry. I wanted to ask about the concept of the state in your research, because the state obviously has a very important role. It's both an end, it's an object of study, it's a process also, it's a means to educate people and so on. So this is of course very important, and as far as I can see, I could understand from your talk, you do conceptualize the state in a way, it's not an agent, it's not an actor, it's perhaps a field of action. It's there's no clear boundary between state and society. There are many different types of states and many different types of state formation, and so on and so forth. So what I wanted to ask, because it was somehow unclear, and also your title is a little bit confusing, I must say, because the first part of your title relates to the state in a way in the old manner, and then your second title is more complex, but it was also a bit fuzzy in your talk. So I wanted to say, where does it take you if you conceptualize the state in this manner, and if you study all these case studies, Palestine and Transjordan and Iraq and the American University in Beirut and so on and so forth. So how do you, what do you make of this conceptualization of the state, and how does it influence your conclusions and your also your framing, but also your conclusions and your findings?
No,
Can we take another question? Hilary, is that okay?
sure. Yeah.
Okay. So
I'll
Melissa,
remember it.
please go ahead, and then Hilary will answer both questions. Go ahead.
That was me, right? You said my name? Okay, great. So what my question is kind of in a different direction. I wanted to say that one of the things I like a lot about the book is that its structure immediately de-exceptionalizes Palestine and the case of Palestinian education history by tying it into the larger mandate structure. But I wonder kind of if that can even be broadened further, and what sort of the role of global ideas about the role of education in society's economies was playing in this story. So for example, if education is no longer like a liberal arts ideal or creating some colonial elite, but sort of a training zone for employment, is this influencing the changing treatment of teachers? And then building on that, of course, you know, we see the rise of mass education outside of the Middle East. And on the one hand, in many places, like in Israel and in the States, you do see this degradation of the teacher's role and the, you know, overworked, underpaid, but you don't see that in all countries. And so I sort of wonder, you know, what's influencing Palestine or Jordan or the, you know, former mandates to follow this trend of, you know, the teaching profession no longer being economically valued, because you tie it to mass education, but that's not, you know, maybe that's not necessarily the case everywhere. So perhaps there's another like special, you know, thing in the sauce that maybe needs to be looked at.
Great. So looking at the state, I think one of the things that I really wanted to do with this kind of model was actually like to push back very specifically on how normally public education is discussed in relation to the state. So what this meant I had to do was to kind of see the state less as like an actor and more as this kind of disaggregate set of institutions, right, that projects an image of unity. And part of what I wanted to look at is to kind of, you know, to sort of not just always see it as this very, you know, kind of linear story of like you have colonialism and then you have post-colonial nation states, and education is where you get the nationalism that directly leads to post-colonial nation states. Also, part of what I wanted to look at was this question of mobility and the state. And so again, in order to do this, you have to see the state as kind of this field that people move in and out of with these fuzzy boundaries, right? And so in an article, I do include this in my book, but it sort of comes out more in the article. I talk about how people who received scholarships from the government sort of saw themselves as already part of it in a certain way, that they had the ability to make claims on it, that they assumed they would get a government job, so they saw themselves as part of it. That said, I think one thing I could have made clearer in the presentation certainly is the really big differences between these mandate states and the nation states that come afterwards, right? So this mandate era, which is where you get this idea of teachers as state builders, is this period where you're getting state bureaucracies, right? So like instead of having this, you know, sort of like Ottoman system where you have provinces, you have like different units, you suddenly have like, okay, like Palestine is now a unit, and we're going to have schools in Palestine that are responsive to this, you know, sort of the like, you know, director of education who's responsible to the mandate government, who's responsible to like the British colonial office. So when you hire teachers in this mandate, you are technically creating a national school system, right? Like you're creating a school system within what will become a national boundary. But the thing is, in order to do that, you're taking people who are actually going all over the place to study. You're having trouble keeping them in the schools because there are so few literate individuals. You can teach for a few years and become something that's better paid, like a lawyer, right? It's, you know, it's a very fluid situation, even though the situation is what is, you know, sort of necessary for this process of state building to occur. And so I think, one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about is this sort of this fuzziness, this fact that public education, which is, sort of being formed in national boundaries, is actually still part of a regional system. And then the fact that it ends, right? That then when you don't have this kind of weak, less interested colonial state, you really have, kind of much more of a structuring of a national system, even if you're still kind of importing people to a lesser degree. Does that make sense? Yeah, Yoni, maybe.
Yeah, I think if you're asking me, I think absolutely. It makes every sense, and I look forward to reading a book. Sounds fascinating.
Great.
Any other question from the crowd before I have a final question?
Oh, can I answer Alyssa's quickly though?
Yes, go ahead. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, sorry.
No problem. So I think this is a good question. I would say, I would be interested in seeing more examples of sort of like teachers maintaining a higher social status as education expands drastically, because I am sure it happens, but it's something where I don't think it's the norm. And like one thing I alluded to really briefly in my talk is that in most countries it happens because teaching as a profession is feminized. So right, like in the US in particular, it's something where in order to expand education much more quickly, people hire women because you can pay them less. So you can open more schools with less money if you have women in teaching professions. And also, and you still tend to have like men in leadership roles. And so it's something where like the assumption is the profession kind of loses its prestige because it becomes seen as like women's work, as closer to child rearing than, the sort of like the kind of, more liberal arts education we've seen. But in the case of like Palestine and the mandates, in part because you tend to have schools segregated by gender. So you don't have the profession becoming like overwhelmingly one of women, and you still have it sort of losing its status. And so part of my argument is that like, okay, suddenly if everybody has a high school degree, like, yes, like technically you could pay everyone with a high school degree more, but the governments kind of choose not to. And again, that allows you to open more high schools. And I would say also, like, in terms of your question about sort of like shifting, sort of global perceptions of education, I really think there's also a global shift I talk about really briefly in the book, which is that in the League of Nations, right, they say education is something each community does for itself, right? Each nation does this for itself, right? So like, it's it's something elitist, right? And it's also kind of, it's not a global norm for people to have a particular kind of education. By the time you get the UN Charter, it is, right? Like they say, like, like the countries are meant to have a certain level of education for their population. It is a right. So I think there's also a global shift in this idea of education being something, elite, to something that everyone has to have like a basic level of. That said, I would say like this debate about sort of education for employability gets dicey with questions of like leadership, right? Like, are you employing somebody to fit a particular job? Or are you educating somebody to then go off and rule as a colonial administrator, right? Like in both cases, you're actually assuming that the person will have a specific job after they get educated. It's just those jobs are supposed to be different. I would say, I do think it plays out very differently, like kind of post World War II than it does beforehand, because I think there is a much greater emphasis on this idea of development and suiting people to particular roles in the economy, and also having those roles be a bit more varied than in the interwar period where, again, especially for British colonial administrators, there is really an idea that like, okay, you have a teeny number of bureaucrats and everybody else should be out farming and having hygienic babies and not causing any trouble. But I do think they're part of global trends, right? There's a lot of influence from the United States, ideas of progressive education as well. But I will save that for future researchers also.
So one final question, unless someone else wants to ask, and I see. So while reading the book, I was thinking about my son. He's third grade. I have one in first grade and second and third grade. And a few months ago, they replaced this teacher because she was pregnant. She gave birth, and so they couldn't find a replacement. They brought someone first year in some kind of training college in Israel, because there aren't trained, qualified teachers that want to enter and become teachers. There's a huge crisis. And I was thinking, to the extent to which this the problems you discuss in the book are also pertinent to the situation, I think not only in Israel, but in some other, first or on the verge of the first world countries, even democracies. Like there's a crisis in the status of the teacher that's, people don't want to teach. And that brings me to the question. I mean, being a parent and thinking about the importance of education, and then re-relating it to the Middle East. What would you say are the main issues for scholars of the Middle East and contemporary Middle East that are relevant also for now that the book brings up? What issues are important for nowadays Middle Eastern historians? And I mean, reading the book, it's some of it is obvious, but what would you say? What's important to you for you now, as a concluding remark?
Well, I do think it's important to think about the fact that the teachers are not inevitably needing to be a sort of overworked, underpaid group, that isn't necessarily the case. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, even though, again, this interwar situation is very different. I would, though, also say, like, one of the big things now, right, is that, sort of the kind of like neoliberalism in education and this idea of, not necessarily, sort of wanting to outsource to kind of more like to private institutions, to outsource to have like parents pay more directly, which again, something you sort of see more in the US with kind of different educational formations. I mean, I think the thing for like scholars of education in the Middle East that I would, like people to keep in mind is kind of to take seriously like other also like other forms of political engagement and other kind of political possibilities as well. Without, I mean, one of the things that, I try to emphasize in the talk in the book is just because people are engaged in pan-Arabism doesn't mean they're not extremely attached to the territories in which they live. But, right, there tends to be this assumption today that like, if you were not, sort of really, really affiliated with precisely the same territory that is in configuration now, that it doesn't count, that it's not old enough. And what I'm trying to kind of show with this book is actually like these things existed at the same time, right? Like that people really had like sort of a, like Hisham Sharabi, like this very intense affiliation with people who came from other areas. But that doesn't negate the sort of affiliation people had for where they came from. And again, and also that the differences would come to the head once people were actually like in control of those areas rather than the British. And I would also say like one thing I didn't talk about that much today is I have a lot of like really fun stories, like particularly of women teachers during this period. So right, like they don't tend to be the ones engaged in these kind of like big politics, like they don't tend to become politicians, but this is also simultaneously happening with women entering professions, and teaching is kind of one of the most accessible ones for women who need to work, but can also stay in a single sex environment. So that's one of the other things, like if you look at the book, I would look for those stories. And also, sort of how like women will use like ideas of tradition against like the British government. So that part's also a lot of fun.
And it's also, I think it's a big challenge because you tried not only writing, I mean, an entire history, right, of British colonialism, and then bringing in stories from all over the region, putting women also into the story, which is hard because you don't have that much, autobiographies and documents that actually talk about these women, because they were marginalized also during those days. I mean, within a more patriarchal system. So I think, but you put them into the story, and I think it's great. It's also another advantage, I think, of this project. I think we need to end this fascinating talk. The questions weren't easy, but you answered them amazingly. And I do recommend, not just because you're my friend, because it's an important book. Do read it. Do you want to put the purchase code again for potential customers? And thank you, Hilary, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for this lovely talk. Hopefully, we'll see you again soon for other talks about new, very good books ahead. So, good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming from all over as well.